Story 1: The Forgotten Highway. The sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the desolate stretch of road known as Route 66. Sarah sat behind the wheel of her old, battered pickup truck. The only sound, the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. Beside her, her best friend Jake stared out of the window, his gaze fixed on the endless expanse of desert that stretched out before them. "Are we lost?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Jake shrugged, his brow furrowing in concern. "I don't think so, but I haven't seen another car for hours. Maybe we should have taken the interstate." Sarah shook her head. "No way. This is supposed to be an adventure, remember? Besides, the old highway is supposed to be faster." But as the miles stretched on and the darkness deepened, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over her like a heavy blanket. The road seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning through the barren landscape, with no signs of civilization in sight. Suddenly, Jake sat up straight in his seat, his eyes widening in alarm. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah glanced in the direction he was pointing, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the figure standing in the middle of the road up ahead. It was a woman, her long white dress billowing in the breeze, her hair whipping around her face in wild tendrils. "Stop the car," Jake said, his voice trembling. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly obeyed, bringing the truck to a halt a few feet away from the woman. They sat in silence for a moment, watching as she approached the vehicle, her movements slow and deliberate. "Should we see if she needs help?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Jake shook his head, his eyes fixed on the woman's face as she drew nearer. "I don't think that's a good idea. Something doesn't feel right about this." But before they could make a decision, the woman was upon them, her face pressed against the window, her eyes wide and vacant. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You have to help me." Sarah recoiled in horror, her hands shaking as she fumbled for the keys in the ignition. But before she could start the truck, the woman vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but a faint trail of mist. "What the hell was that?" Jake asked, his voice trembling with fear. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I think we should get out of here. Now." With that, she slammed her foot down on the gas pedal, the truck lurching forward as they sped away into the night. As they drove, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something sinister lurked just beyond the edge of the darkness. She kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her grip on the steering wheel white-knuckled as they hurtled through the night. But no matter how fast they drove, they couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over them like a shroud, nor the sense that they were being drawn inexorably towards some unknown horror. Hours passed, the darkness giving way to the first faint light of dawn as they finally reached the outskirts of a small rundown town. Sarah breathed a sigh of relief, her heart pounding in her chest as she pulled the truck to a stop in front of a dilapidated motel. "We made it," Jake said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. But as they stepped out of the truck and made their way towards the entrance, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled into something far more sinister than they could have ever imagined. The motel was deserted, the air thick with the stench of decay. As they made their way down the narrow hallway, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following their every move. But despite their growing sense of unease, they pressed on, their footsteps echoing in the empty silence as they made their way towards their room at the end of the hall. But when they finally reached the door and stepped inside, they were greeted by a sight that sent chills down their spines. The room was empty, save for a single tattered mattress lying on the floor in the center of the room, and sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on them with a look of hunger in her eyes, was the woman they had seen on the road. "We've been waiting for you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Sarah and Jake froze, their hearts pounding in their chests as they stared at the woman in horror. They knew then that they were not alone, that something unspeakable lurked in the darkness, waiting to claim them for its own. And as the woman rose from the bed and advanced towards them, her lips curling into a twisted smile, they knew that they were about to become the latest victims of the Forgotten Highway. Story 2: The Haunted Detour. The old sedan rumbled along the winding road, its headlights cutting through the dense fog that enveloped the night. Behind the wheel, Alex gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of his stomach. "This road wasn't on the map," Sarah said, her voice tinged with concern as she peered at the unfamiliar path ahead. Alex glanced at the faded map on the dashboard, furrowing his brow in confusion. "That's strange. We must have taken a wrong turn somewhere." As they drove deeper into the fog-shrouded forest, the trees seemed to close in around them, casting eerie shadows that danced along the road. Sarah's fingers tapped nervously on her seat as they passed a sign that read, "Welcome to Whispering Pines." "Should we turn back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex hesitated, glancing at the fuel gauge, which hovered dangerously close to empty. We might as well keep going for a bit. Maybe we'll come across a gas station or someone who can give us directions. But as they drove on, the fog grew thicker, obscuring their vision and making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The road seemed to twist and turn at random, leading them deeper into the heart of the forest. Suddenly, the sedan lurched to a stop, the engine sputtering and dying with a final gasp. Alex tried to restart it, but the engine remained stubbornly silent. "We're out of gas," he muttered, his frustration mounting. Sarah's eyes darted nervously around the darkened forest, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do we do now?" Alex glanced at the map again, his finger tracing the winding road that seemed to lead nowhere. "There's supposed to be a town not far from here. We can try to walk." Reluctantly, they gathered their belongings and stepped out of the car into the chilly night air. The fog clung to them like a shroud as they made their way along the deserted road, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. As they walked, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that unseen eyes followed their every move. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as they passed by gnarled trees that seemed to reach out to them with twisted limbs. After what felt like hours of walking, they finally came upon the outskirts of Whispering Pines. But the town was unlike any they had ever seen before. The buildings were dilapidated and crumbling, their windows boarded up and their doors hanging off their hinges. The streets were empty and silent, devoid of any signs of life. "We shouldn't be here," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. But Alex pressed on, determined to find help. As they made their way deeper into the town, they heard a faint, haunting melody drifting through the air. "What is that?" Sarah asked, her heart pounding in her chest. Alex listened, his brow furrowing in confusion. "I don't know. It sounds like music." They followed the sound to an old rundown inn at the edge of town. The music grew louder as they approached, the haunting melody echoing through the empty streets. Cautiously, they pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The inn was dimly lit, the air heavy with dust and the scent of decay. And there, in the center of the room, they found an old gramophone, its needle scratching against a worn vinyl record. The music swelled around them, filling the room with an otherworldly melody. As they stood there, transfixed by the haunting music, they suddenly became aware of a presence in the room with them. They turned, their hearts freezing in their chests as they saw the figures standing in the shadows. The inn was filled with ghostly apparitions, their faces twisted in agony as they danced to the haunting tune. Sarah and Alex watched in horror as the ghosts swirled around them, their movements becoming more frantic and desperate with each passing moment. "We have to get out of here," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with fear. But as they turned to flee, they found their path blocked by the ghostly figures, their empty eyes fixed on them with a hunger that sent shivers down their spines. Trapped in the haunted inn, surrounded by vengeful spirits, Sarah and Alex realized with dawning horror that they were doomed to join the spectral dance forever. Their screams echoed through the empty halls as the music grew louder and the ghosts closed in around them, sealing their fate on that cursed road trip to Whispering Pines. Story 3. The Vanishing Highway. The old pickup truck rattled along the desolate highway, the sound of the engine echoing through the empty expanse of the desert. Mark gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white as he peered into the darkness ahead. "How much farther to the next town?" Emily asked, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. Mark glanced at the map on the dashboard, squinting in the dim light of the dashboard. "According to this, it should be just up ahead. Shouldn't be more than another hour or so." But as they drove on, the highway seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the horizon nothing but a vast expanse of darkness. The only light came from the dim glow of the truck's headlights illuminating the road ahead in a narrow cone. Suddenly, Emily let out a gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as she pointed out the window. "Look." Mark followed her gaze, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the figure standing at the side of the road. It was a young woman, her long hair blowing in the wind, her face obscured by the shadows. "Should we stop?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with concern. Mark hesitated, glancing at the empty road ahead. "I don't know. It could be dangerous." But before he could make a decision, the woman stepped out onto the road, her arms outstretched as if in need of help. Mark slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop just a few feet away from her. "Are you okay?" he called out, rolling down the window. The woman's voice was soft, barely more than a whisper. "Please, you have to help me. My car broke down and I've been waiting here for hours." Mark exchanged a glance with Emily, his brow furrowing in concern. "Where's your car?" The woman pointed down the road, her finger trembling in the darkness. "It's just a little ways down. Please, I'm scared to go back alone." Mark hesitated, his instincts warning him that something wasn't right. But against his better judgment, he opened the door and stepped out onto the road. "Stay in the truck," he told Emily, his voice firm. Together, he and the woman set off down the road, the darkness pressing in around them like a suffocating blanket. The only sound was the crunch of a gravel beneath their feet and the distant howl of the wind. But as they walked, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that unseen eyes followed their every move. He glanced back over his shoulder, his heart pounding in his chest, but saw nothing but the empty road stretching out behind them. After what felt like hours of walking, they finally came upon the woman's car. It was an old sedan, its headlights shattered and its tires flat. "Thank you so much for helping me," the woman said, her voice filled with gratitude. But as Mark knelt down to inspect the car, he realized with a sinking feeling in his stomach that something was terribly wrong. The car was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if it had been abandoned for weeks. "We need to go," he said, his voice urgent. But before they could make a move, the woman suddenly lunged at him, her hands grabbing for his throat with surprising strength. Mark fought back, his heart racing as he struggled to break free. "Emily, help!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the darkness. But when he looked up, he realized with horror that Emily was gone. The truck was nowhere to be seen, and they were completely alone on the desolate highway. With a surge of adrenaline, Mark broke free from the woman's grasp and staggered to his feet. He ran down the road, his heart pounding in his chest as he searched desperately for any sign of Emily or the truck. But the highway seemed to stretch endlessly before him, the darkness swallowing him whole. He heard the woman's laughter echoing through the night, taunting him as he ran, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the laughter stopped. Mark skidded to a stop, his heart pounding in his chest as he looked around in confusion. The highway was empty, the only sound the howl of the wind and the distant cry of a lone coyote. Emily and the truck were nowhere to be seen, as if they had vanished into thin air. Mark sank to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he realized with dawning horror that he was completely alone on the haunted highway. The woman's laughter echoed in his ears as he sat there, the darkness closing in around him. And as he sat there, surrounded by the suffocating silence of the desert, Mark knew that he would never escape the vanishing highway, doomed to wander its empty expanse for all eternity.